Well, I'm Gianluca Tramontana, and we're here to discuss the book Dinosaur Derivatives and Other Trades. And I'm with the book's author, my good friend Jeremy Josse.
Hi, Gianluca, and thanks for giving me the time and supporting the book.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining me, Jeremy. And I have to say, this is a very curious book on finance. Not dry like most books, or like we would think of books on finance
right.
to be. So it's kind of part fact, part fiction, part analysis. What were you really trying to get at with this?
So I guess, actually the whole book summed up in the first paragraph just of the acknowledgements, where, I say that, I've spent 25 years in the finance business, and I say that it's a pretty serious sort of venture and activity usually, but at the same time it suffers from these regular and continual sort of existential crises where most financiers, certainly me, I ask myself, what's the point of all of this, right? And so that question is something I guess you can ask of lots of things in life, but it's I think it's particularly true of finance. And why is it particularly true of finance? Well, on the one hand, finance isn't really about economics. It's not really about the real economy. It's not about industry, actually doing industry or agriculture. What it is about these tokens, these securities which are themselves stories or fictions representing the underlying economy. So financiers spend their time dabbling in these bits of paper, and in fact that's the reason why many people say finance is just parasitic on the underlying economy. So that's true. On the one hand, it is parasitic on the underlying economy, but on the other hand, as we've seen in the credit crisis, and we see regularly, when finance doesn't work, the whole system falls to pieces, right? Finance is in many ways the blood and the brains of the whole system. So you've got this strange dichotomy where it seems this sort of slight parasitic, pointless activity, and yet it's also fundamental to our actual daily economic lives. So that is, I think that's the origin of the whole book. And in many of the other questions and puzzles and paradoxes and hypocrisies that come out later in the book are really come from that central dilemma.
And how did you develop this viewpoint? What's your background on this?
So I studied a bunch of philosophy and economics when I was a student, and both as an undergraduate and as a graduate, and even to the point where I thought of being a philosopher myself. And what I realized was that philosophy it's a pretty rarefied subject, and there's probably only about 20 philosophers in the world who've ever said anything vaguely original, and I figured I wasn't quite bright enough to be one of those 20, and so I said, I'm not going to do philosophy. What else is there to do? Finance. Nothing else to do, of course. So I went and did finance. But obviously, throughout my financial career, those sort of philosophical hankerings were always there, and so I was always questioning exactly what I was doing, and always had this slight puzzlement about the whole enterprise, and that's the origin of the book. It took me a long time to figure out how to express that puzzlement, but here it is.
Some of these stories are very, very fantastical. How's the reader supposed to take these? Are we supposed to take them seriously or with a pinch of salt? Or are they just complete fairy tales?
Well, that's a very good question, because some of the people who have read them have been slightly confused themselves as they're reading through them. So, I say in the introduction that actually they're a mixture of things. On the one hand, some of them are total fantasies that I've invented. On the other hand, some of them are based on legends of old, like the story of Faust or the story of Joseph from the Old Testament. Some of them are stories, actually real stories, based on my own career. So they're a mixture of all of those things. The key point about all of them is what they tell you is how not to do finance, right? How not to do business. The last thing you want to do is do finance in the way that is seen in these stories.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of go a little bit into, one of the stories, for example, there's a character, Carl, and he has an experience in an auction over a call for an option for an extinct prehistoric shark known as a megalodon.
Right.
It seems to, the whole story seems to want to tell us that the most bizarre, that there exist sort of bizarre and even, dare I say it, meaningless types of contracts that often have real life value. I mean, do you actually believe that? Is this actually possible?
Well, I think so. Okay, so the story is trying to ask you: here you have a contract to buy a megalodon. And so a megalodon is a prehistoric animal that doesn't exist. So it's a contract to buy something that doesn't exist. So is it possible, under what circumstances could such a contract have any value? Now, if you'd asked me that question, 25 years ago before I started finance, I would have said, well, of course it couldn't have any value. That's nonsense. But that's actually not my experience, having worked in the industry for a long time. And I think one of the things we find is that all sorts of strange things turn out to have value, a lot of it because of human convention, and sometimes it's because of faith in a business proposition. We saw that in the internet bubble. Sometimes it's just an idea. Sometimes it's diamonds, gold. There's all sorts of things which really don't necessarily have underlying value, and yet we attribute very significant real economic value to them, and that's what's going on there. And you'll have to read the story to figure out exactly how a megalodon contract could have value, but that's the core of it.
Yeah, no, I'd have to say I'd never heard of a megalodon before I read the book. I mean, out of all the animals you could have picked a Tyrannosaurus Rex or anything. Right. I mean, why did you choose a megalodon?
Well, look, you're spot on. So you could certainly choose any dinosaur, right? That's for sure. But actually, you could choose anything, right? It could be a contract to buy Mickey Mouse, who doesn't really exist either. It could be SpongeBob. It could be the slaves of Ramesses II, who were for sale, but that was 3,000 years ago. So it could be all sorts of things that don't exist. But for your listener, megalodons are actually not strictly dinosaurs. What they are is extinct giant sharks, right? And in fact, these enormous sharks with these huge mouth. A huge mouth with these huge teeth, and in fact you can fit a whole human being inside just the mouth. So they're sharks, and of course everybody thinks of Wall Street sharks, and so it had to be a megalodon. So that was the origin of that. And in fact, there I was one day in the Metropolitan Museum with my kids, and you can see there they don't have a whole megalodon, but they have a set of megalodon jaws. And I looked up at that megalodon jaw, and quite literally I said, of course, that's it. That tells me all about value, financial value, just sitting there. So that was the origin of it.
Yes. I mean, and there's the human elements in this story. A character called Carl, the man who's at the auction. Who is this figure? Who is Carl?
Well, so look, I guess Carl is it's a complicated thing. I mean, he could be just me. He could be all of us. He's a big mixture. I think the bigger thing, he's confused, right? I mean, the whole experience is very dislocating for him, and he finds it strange that this asset could be for sale. So he's confused, and many of us are confused in all sorts of ways. And I think Carl is with us. He's sometimes with us, and sometimes he isn't. I mean, on a good day when everything seems to make sense and everything is rationally fitting together, then there are no cars around. But in my experience, certainly in the finance world, that's not the norm. So the norm is something odd is going on, something a bit inexplicable, and that's when Carl is with you. So he's this confused character. Now, of course, Carl has all sorts of other linkages and representations. I mean, maybe he had a big beard, in which case he was Karl Marx, and he would have been, I suspect, particularly puzzled by the whole Megalodon auction. Maybe he shaved off the beard and sort of became a libertarian. Maybe, I don't know, maybe he was Karl Lagerfeld, another capitalist. Maybe Karl the Crocodile. I don't know if you know Karl the Crocodile. He's a kid's fictional character.
Oh, yes.
It could be that. So there's all sorts of possibilities.
No, well, I mean, this is kind of a good spot to stay on some of the characters in this book. There's a character called Terry, a computer hacker. He in the book he breaks into the core systems of the central banks, and instead of stealing the money, though, he turns into sort of a high-tech Robin Hood, if you like.
Right.
He delivers wads of cash that sort of appear in everyone's accounts the next morning. Can you tell me a little bit about this story and what you were trying to illustrate with this?
Yeah, so look, it's very simple, really. The first thing is, your listeners have got to understand that today 98% of all our money is not physical money. There's not a lot of actual physical printing of money going on anymore. It's just electronic blips. It's just the numbers that appear in all our electronic accounts. And that has a lot of significance, and it's been a revolution over the last 20 years. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that what happens if someone can actually break into these systems, right? It's not easy, but in theory, it's possible. Well, I think normally what we would think is if someone broke into these systems, they would, you would think some hacker would go and try and steal all the money. And you can think of your typical sort of James Bond movie, right, where you've got the baddie there, and he's some IT genius, and he's busy downloading some system, and he's got 10 minutes to do it, and having done that, he's stolen $1 zillion. Well, so that's I think your sort of normal paradigm. But I wanted to say, well, let's turn that on its head, and as you've just described, and describe a situation where our hacker is a sort of sweetie at heart, and he doesn't really want to steal anything. What he wants to do is give everybody lots of electronic money, and so he has the unique facility to do that through his hacking capabilities, and he gives everybody all this electronic money. But the irony and the essence of the story is that, of course, in doing that, he creates massive inflation and hyperinflation. And so the ultimate twist is that he probably causes, indeed he does cause, much more damage by his beneficence than had he actually stolen the money. And that's really what the story's about.
Is this character completely fictional, or is he someone that you might have known or come across in your past?
Well, I think so. It's a very, it's a fair question. I live in New York. We live in New York, and New York is full of. There are some rich guys, and there are a lot of very poor people as well. And you see hobos on the street every day in New York. And as I pass some of these hobos, I see Terry, right? Some of these guys are, to my mind, Terry. And how do they get by? Well, they get by a bit like the Artful Dodger in Charles Dickens. They get by a bit of thieving, a bit of mischief here and there. And it's what they have to do because of just the sheer vexation of life, right? And so that was the origin of Terry. Now, I then said, well, imagine if one of these guys, is a little bit of a pirate, but actually he's also an IT genius. And what would that do to his life? My conclusion was that he'd probably still screw up. I mean, he would probably still cause carnage, but just in a different way. The form of the carnage would be different. So that rather than his sort of petty thievery, he would apply, on the one hand, his good heart, but on the other hand, his devious ways to this hacking scheme, which ultimately causes total chaos. So that's really where Terry comes from.
He is a real guy, then.
Well, I mean, I've seen a few hobos around who I thought were Terry, but not really. No, I guess not.
Well, I'm happy to hear that.
yeah.
There's another one, parentheses 2 of Atlantis, or parentheses a second of Atlantis.
Right. To give him his correct name.
His correct name. Right, exactly. I will say parentheses the second.
Exactly.
Correct, of Atlantis.
Yeah.
He's a philosopher king, we're told, chief architect behind the political economics of the lost city. Can you sort of explain the general philosophy of parentheses and what impact the philosophy had on Atlantis?
Yeah, so you've got to start with this story by then just the basics of Plato. And Plato believed that basically the best way to run a state and to run, well, in those days, Greek city-states was to have these philosopher kings running them. And in all the ideas in philosophy, it's got to be one of the most stupid because we all know that some of the greatest academics are not necessarily great leaders, right? But that's what Plato thought. And well, being a philosopher, he was probably a bit biased. But anyway, that's what he thought. Now, funnily enough, I think actually in our society we've taken it to the other extreme, and the most dim people tend to be our politicians and our leaders. So I'm not sure we've got it right either. But anyway, that parentheses is one of these philosopher kings, and what he's very focused on is the idea of merit, the idea that all wealth should be distributed according to people's merit. And this, it sounds like a decent idea, but when you actually analyse this idea, and a lot of serious thinkers have analysed this idea, it can be interpreted in one way, actually in a very socialistic way. It could also be interpreted actually in a very capitalistic way. And that's sort of what the story is about. And it's not just a story, but the whole book, one of my themes in the book is that we're locked today in this slightly banal dichotomy between socialism and capitalism. It's very entrenched, particularly in the USA. And actually, it's a relatively modern dichotomy. It's probably the product of the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. I don't think people in medieval days thought in those terms. I don't think in ancient times people thought in those terms. Certainly hunter-gatherers didn't think in those terms. So, part of the story is to show that this dichotomy of socialism and capitalism is just not nuanced enough to explain the political economic problems we face today. At any rate, parentheses, he's a typical Greek philosopher. He takes the idea of merit to its absolute extreme, and frankly, the end result is that he sinks the whole of Atlantis under his ideas.
And this is clearly based on facts. I mean, there's clearly archaeological evidence about an Atlantis tax system.
No, I don't think so. No, I mean, there's very little evidence of Atlantis at all. I mean, I think some evidence in Homer and Plato, but no. So we don't even know whether Atlantis existed. But here's the thing: I do think we're all sort of living in this Atlantis. We're all subject to these badly thought through concepts of political redistribution, both on the left and the right. And so I think, frankly, on a daily basis, we're all busy sinking in the lost city of Atlantis.
So a total fairy tale, then.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this sort of brings us back to parentheses. Did he ever feature in Greek history, or is parentheses and his friend Mediocrities are they a total product of La La Land, or what?
Well, look, I think parentheses lives with us all today. I mean, yes, he didn't really exist in Greek history, but parentheses. What are parentheses? Well, parentheses are all those sort of side comments that we all say at the end of our main sentence. And certainly I think all of us often say the most interesting things at the end of our main sentence, right? The hidden bit after we finished our first sentence. And so that's the origin of the parentheses idea. And of course, in many ways it's a very Freudian idea. I mean, that's what Freud was always telling us. And although I think Freud got it completely wrong, because Freud took it all far too seriously. He sort of thought, well, that these sort of side comments express all sorts of hidden desires and all sorts of hidden stuff about our childhood. But actually it doesn't. Those side comments, they're just intellectual curiosities, and they're often funny, they're often humorous. And so that's really where parentheses comes from. Everything that's important is in parentheses. Now, but he was a thinker, and he wasn't necessarily a salesman, so he had to have a buddy to sell his ideas, and hence his buddy Mediocrities. And Mediocrities is very real, because frankly, he's just about every single TV showman that I've ever seen, who has a lot of views, and he has a platform, and he comes out with all sorts of ideas, and very few of them are developed, and he usually knows not what exactly he's saying. So that's Mediocrities.
Well, that's fascinating, and I have to say I want to explore so much more. We've only really touched 3 chapters in this book and barely scratched the surface, but I have to say, unfortunately, we're out of time. But this is just a complete financial wonderland, really. Very insightful, very amusing, and a very strange prism. Gives the reader sort of unique and really quite wonderful and colourful insights really into modern finance. I guess the viewer will just have to read the book to find out more about this this rather weird and murky world. Anyway, it's a wonderful and very amusing take on this, and I must thank you very much, Jeremy, for joining me.
Thank you, Gianluca, and thank you for supporting the book.
Yeah, thank you, and please come back.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
write another book.
Okay, very good.